but I want to start by saying this. I'm proud to be a part of a community of people who want to create safe space for people to grow. And I'm proud to be able to, whenever people ask me online, they'll say, well, what is Ethos? And I love telling people we're a values-driven community that really focuses on finding ways for all of us to grow, even though we don't always agree on everything. Actually, I would say most of the time we don't agree. And we still find ways, continue to find ways to lift one another up and grow. And I don't think that you will find that many places. And so this, for me, is this beautiful oasis where we come together, and it's not about what Tony Wuerfel thinks. It's not about what Jason thinks, or Lance thinks, or Georgiana thinks. It's about what we do, the magic that happens when we come together and begin wrestling with ideas. And so some of the, did you guys enjoy the last series we did over the values? That was good, wasn't it? And we talked about how to show up. How to show up, be present for people. That's a value we have. And we talked about holding space. When someone's going through something, we don't turn to someone and say, hey, praying for you. And then walk away and do nothing. That's not who we are. We say, how can I help? Megan, your car, the tire popped. Megan, who's right there in the back, y'all wondered who I was talking about a couple of weeks ago. I don't just say to Megan, hey, man, bummer. You got AAA? I say, wow, what can we do for you? How can we help? We ask how we can help. And then we get interested. It's so easy, especially on social media, to not ask questions of people, to not seek to ask, like, well, why do you think what you think? It's very easy to just like bludgeon away, and believe me, I was there this past week. How do we get interested? How do we show support and that we want to be here present for you? Those are things that we value here. So we have this new series, The Art of Deconstruction. And it was fun to me because many of you, we asked, what do you want to talk about for the next 5 weeks before we get into Thanksgiving season and Christmas season? What do you want to talk about? And you gave us a bunch of ideas. You said, we want to hear some of this fleshed out a little bit more. And so, disclaimer, I'm going to share my perspective. All right? And I'm going to share some ideas, and I'm going to deconstruct some things. And I'm going to challenge some of you. And here's the thing. If you don't like it, that's okay. If it challenges you, that's what we're here for. We want to be challenged. We want to grow. We want to learn to see things in maybe a different light. And so the art of deconstruction is really when we begin asking how, why, and then what's the point of the whole thing. And so we're going to go through some different topics like, we're going to talk about homosexuality, especially in regard to like faith systems. What does that mean? What does the Bible actually say? What does it not say, more importantly? We'll talk about Jesus. Who was Jesus, and why is Jesus even relevant today to our culture? We'll talk about the ideas of like heaven, hell. Well, where did that come from? We'll talk about a lot of those discussions. And today, I'm going to talk about how to read an ancient book without losing your gray matter. You guys ready? Cool. I thought in order to do this, I'm going to bring up the sacred book of Dr. Seuss. And I'm going to read you a little bit of this one. I'm not going to read the whole thing because we don't have the entire time. But this book is called The Butter Battle Book. And I'm going to read you some of it, not all of it, but I'm going to read it to you. And I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. On the last day of summer, 10 hours before fall, my grandfather took me out to the wall. Did I double click? There you go. Okay. For a while he stood silent. Then finally he said with a very sad shake of his very old head, as you know, on this side of the wall we are Ukes. On the far side of the wall live the Zooks. Then my grandfather said, it's high time that you knew of the terribly horrible things that Zooks do. In every Zook house and in every Zook town, every Zook eats his bread with the butter side down. Terrible. But we Ukes, as you know, when we breakfast or sup, spread our bread, Grandpa said, with the butter side up. That's the right, honest way, Grandpa gritted his teeth. So you can't trust a Zook who spreads bread underneath. Every Zook must be watched. He has kinks in his soul. That's why as a youth I made watching my goal. Watching Zooks for the Zook watching border patrol. In those days, of course, the wall wasn't so high and I could look any Zook square in the eye. If he dared to come close, I could give him a twitch with my tough, tufted, prickly snickberry switch. For a while, that worked fine. All the Zooks strayed away, and our country was safe. Then one terrible day, a very rude Zook by the name of Van Itch snuck up and slingshotted my snickberry switch. With my broken off switch, with my head hung in shame, to the chief Ukaroo in great sorrow I came. But our leader just smiled. He stood, "You're not to blame. And those Zooks will be sorry they started this game. Well, dress you right up in the fanciest suit. We'll give you a fancier slingshot to shoot." And he ordered the boys in the back of the room to figure how we'd build me some sort of triple sling jigger. With my triple sling jigger, I sure felt much bigger. I marched to the wall with great vim and great vigor, right up to Van Itch with my hand on the trigger. "I'll have no more nonsense," I said with a frown, "from Zooks who eat bread with the butter side down." Van Itch looked quite sickly. He ran off quite quickly. I'm unhappy to say he came back the next day in a spiffy new suit with a big new machine. And he snarled as he said, looking frightfully mean, "You may fling those hard rocks with your triple sling jigger, but I also have my own hand on a trigger. My wonderful weapon, the jigger rock, snatch 'em, we'll fling 'em right back as quick as we catch 'em. We'll have no more nonsense. We'll take no more gup from you Ukes who eat bread with the butter side up." Skipping some pages. Violence escalates. If I was smart, I would have put bookmarks in there. They thought up a great one, they certainly did. They thought up a gun called the Kickapoo Kid, which they loaded with powerful poo-doo powder and ants' eggs and bee legs and dried fried clam chowder. And they carefully trained a real smart dog named Daniel to serve as our country's first gun-toting spaniel. I was racing pell-mell when I heard a voice yell, "If you sprinkle us Zooks, you'll get sprinkled as well." Van Itch had a sputter exactly like mine, and he yelled, "My blue gooer is working just fine, and if I'm here to say if you Ukes can goo Zooks, you'd better forget it, because Zooks can goo Ukes." Try to say that 10 times fast. More violence escalates. I raced to his office. This place was a sight. "Have no fears," said the chief. "Everything's all right. My bright backroom boys have been brighter than bright. They've thought up a gadget that's newer than new. It's filled with mysterious moo-laka-moo and can blow all those Zooks clear to Salamagoo." And you don't want to go to Salamagoo, believe me. They invented the bitsy big boy boomeroo. You just run to the wall like a nice little man, drop this bomb on the Zooks just as fast as you can. I've ordered all Ukes to stay safe underground while the bitsy big boy bomberoo is around. Oops. That's when Grandfather found me. He grabbed me. He said, "You should be down the hole, and you're up here instead. But perhaps this is all for the better somehow. You will see me make history right here and right now." Grandpa leapt up the wall with a luptuous leap, and he cleared his hoarse throat with a bopulous beep. He screamed, "Here's the end of the terrible town full of Zooks who eat bread with the butter side down." And at that very instant, we heard a clup-clup of feet on the wall, and old Van Itch clupped up. The boys in his back room had made him one too. In his fist was another big boy boomeroo. I'll blow you up, he yelled, into pork and wee beans. I'll butter side up you to small smithereens. Grandpa shouted, be careful, OG. What's going to drop it? Will you or will he? Be patient, Grandpa said. We'll see. We'll see. Question. Is this story true? Is this story true? Talk to me. Is this story true? It might not have happened, but it happens. Okay. It happens. It may not happen. Okay. Okay. Got it. Anyone else? Interesting parallels to the past. Okay. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Okay. Interesting. Got it. Good for you. Is it true? How is it true? Good. How is this true? Yes. Beautiful. Is it true? This story, most kids who read this story today, it's a story. It's a fun Dr. Seuss story. But if you were to read this in the mid-1950s, this story would not just be some cute children's story. It wasn't. This story right here was a politically charged piece that many people called propaganda. Isn't that interesting? Seuss was actually a very controversial figure for quite a while. Today, they're kind of just cute stories. Back then, this story had some really interesting meaning. What we're doing is we're talking about metaphor. We're talking about the thing behind the thing. We're looking at something much deeper, aren't we? This story right here, what this did for you is it not only questioned some interesting history, but it also started to cause you to have to think about maybe your own life, where you may have done similar things in the past. It may have caused you to question or consider various things, various interactions, various conversations. It did what literalism can't do. It did only what metaphor and poetry can do. It caused you to think on many different levels. And so this book came out around the time where after we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we had this arms race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And we kept building, and there's this question, of course, as to what happens with the winner. How do we know who the winner is, right? How do we know who has more, the person with the weapons, what are they going to do with it once you have the most? Terrifying question at that time era. And so, of course, anyone reading this at that time period, they understood there's a reason one's in blue and one's in orange, right? The two different sides. When you're reading this, you would pick up immediately this interesting wall. For us today, our kids will be like, oh, why do they have a wall? Well, we don't have those conversations as much anymore. We build up different walls, of course. The president of the U.S., Seuss actually said when he was creating this character, he had Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and especially, he says, Reagan in mind when he was writing this piece. Arms race, of course, we see the escalation of violence, and of course, the big boy boomeroo, the nuclear bomb. If you were alive during that time era, this story, it hit you in the gut. It actually caused you to have to think about a current situation going on right there, right now. Now, for many of us, we came from a background where we read a book called the Bible. The Bible, yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the word of God, the Bible. Anyone? We were taught to read it in certain ways. And here's the thing. In this group alone, we have many different people who are going to view that book differently. We're going to have some people that are going to view the stories and say, this literally happened. This is how scientifically creation happens. I'm reading this thing fully, literally, and you know what? There's space for you here. We may not fully agree. That's okay. There's some people who are going to say, you know what? When I read this, I've begun to challenge certain things, deconstruct certain things. I'm still trying to figure it out. You're right there in the middle, and you're saying, what does it mean? What is it? Welcome. You have a place here. And then there's other of you who are saying, I can't stand that you keep using this book. Like, I wish you would use other books. There are some of you who are saying, man, I find wisdom in all different books. Why do we have to just keep going back to this one? I get it, man. I love you. You're here, and we're so thankful you're here. And we will continue finding beauty in many different places. So please understand, in this room alone, we have many different perspectives over this book. But please stay with me here because we're going to go through a couple different ways of reading it. You guys ready? And by the way, if you hear something interesting, this is great. We can speak up here. Cool. There's this group of people called the Israelites, and they got basically overthrown over and over again. They were a nomadic group of people. And nomadic means they were constantly traveling around. They would take a place for a time and settle, but guess how long they would be there? Well, 10 to 100 years maybe. And then all of a sudden, a new empire comes in, and they take over. And when a new empire comes in, what they'll often do is they will tell you, not ask you, to assimilate. Their gods become your gods. Their culture becomes your culture. Their way of life becomes your way of life, right? And so Israel, this happens over and over and over again. And in 587 BC, they're taken by a group called the Babylonians. This was the largest military force in the Middle East. They were taking over land like nobody else. And this group of people, the Israelites, they are marched on feet after watching their temple destroyed, which, by the way, was the place they believed all religious stuff came from, totally destroyed, which meant the question of, is our God dead or not, is circulating in their head, in their mind. So they're marched all that way to Babylon, and they get there, and the question, of course, is, do we assimilate or not? Do we accept their gods or not? Do we accept their culture, their beliefs, or not? What do we do? Some of you, you have grandparents, or maybe you had grandparents, and they talk about the old world, don't they? Some of you got tattoos, and they were like, oh my gosh. Like in the old days, we would never do that, right? You do what? Have you forgotten? Do you even remember the recipe to good bacon tie? Like, come on, like we had it, and you lost it. You're assimilating, you're missing it. And so the Israelites in this moment, they said, how do we hold on to who we are? And what they did is what you and I do. We start telling the stories. Those stories from the past that have been passed down generationally. Ever sit around a campfire? It just begs to have stories told, doesn't it? Not that long ago, I was sitting around a campfire, and we started talking about stories of like bowel movements. Like weird stuff comes out of campfire stories. You know what I'm talking about. Weird stuff. You just start telling stories, and who knows where these stories are going. Am I right? It just happens. You start telling stories. And those stories, oftentimes, you will connect, and you'll say, yeah, because that's the story behind the story. And so these people are marched, and they begin filling the space because they don't want to assimilate. But here's the thing. They told the stories, they compiled the stories, not to create a history that was sealed, tight, perfect. They didn't write these stories, compile them to say, now we have to have a good history book that tells exactly how everything happened, who we were. They weren't writing history. What they were doing was they were sharing stories to remind them of the good days, to remind them that we weren't always in this place. The messages that also were filled with a lot of wisdom. We keep getting back here in the same place over and over and over again. Why? What can we learn from our past? And so they told stories to remind them of where they'd been where they're heading, and what they can do potentially different next time around. These were the stories. And when someone read or listened to a story about Joshua, about Moses, about Abraham, here's what they were taught to do as Jewish people. They were taught to say this: before I read this piece, I must remember I too am Moses. I too am Abraham. I too am Joshua. That's how they read this, because they saw themselves in it. Every character, every person, everything in there is Israel miniaturized. We tracking so far? Yeah? Sweet. Okay, let's keep going. This cycle, we've talked about this a little bit, and I'm just recapping. Every story in the Bible has a cycle to it. Every character goes through life, death, they fall into exile, captivity, and then they experience new life again. Just like some of you went through a painful relationship. The thing died. You moved through it. New life was on the other side. Hope, faith kept you moving. And on the other side of it, you have new life again. And that story is in every story that I read lately. Those are the stories I think that hum. And so for the Israelites, the reality is Genesis is not the oldest book in the Old Testament, by the way. It's Job. Job would have been the oldest. It asks the ancient question of what do we do when brokenness and pain happens, and who is the one giving us that? That was the answer, or the question they were attempting to ask in Job. But the book of Genesis, it starts like any story would. It starts at the beginning. But please understand, they were not seeking to deal with a question like, how did the world scientifically begin? They just weren't. And honestly, neither were any of the other civilizations. They weren't asking that question. They were saying, where did our tribe come from? Who are we? Where are we heading? How do we keep getting here? So the story goes like this. Their God steps into chaos and then begins to fill it. Clear space and then fill it. In your life right now, some of you keep landing in chaos. You're in the middle of chaos over and over again. Well, how do you keep getting there? What kind of space do you need to clear? And what, after clearing, do you need to start filling it with? That's the story Israel is asking themselves. That's a question. And here's one of the answers. When we fill our space, let's make sure to fill it now with things that bring life. Is anyone loving this? Okay, good. Let me keep going. So the Jewish story, what you'll notice is they bring up things like Shabbat, right? They bring up the idea of a serpent. If you are a nomadic people and you're wandering around the wilderness with camels and stuff, what one animal is definitely going to wreck your day? Yeah, because camels and things, they carry a lot of baggage with them, right? When that camel gets bitten by a snake, who's carrying that load? You are. Those things, foul creatures, right? So what they do is they have this beautiful, or not beautiful, but this interesting moment of like, that's pure evil. That's the thing that would cause the whole thing to go awry. Got it? Interesting. Babylonian story of how their tribe begins is different. Their tribe starts with a really chaotic, violent moment because the Babylonians were a violent tribe. And so for them, Son, God, destroys Mother God and cuts her in half. And she becomes the sky and the earth. Because for them, the only way to experience fullness life is by taking life. Thank goodness, like we don't believe that anymore. Good. The Egyptian story, it starts by essentially a very similar one as the Jewish and the Babylonians. Like they took the two and they kind of melded them together. The Egyptian story being probably one of the oldest. The river floods. Again, if you are living by a Nile river and you're completely dependent on it, your story is going to revolve around the Nile river, water. And so the waters flood, it creates chaos, and then life begins to spill forth. That's how they essentially say their tribe forms. Notice that each one of those tribes, the story has definite elements of their own culture and their own belief. Anyone notice that there? Yeah. The Egyptian story is not going to involve Shabbat. The Babylonian story is not going to involve a peaceful God that comes in and tries to clear space and remove chaos. It's going to be the ones that step in and create the chaos through violence. Do you see the differences? Let me give you more. There's always a temptation narrative in every culture. The Jewish story is a guy named Dirt and a woman named Breath Dirt. That's how you would have read this story, by the way. It was not, there was a guy named Adam, there's like a girl named Eve. It was Dirt and Dirt Breath, right? And what they do is they essentially eat knowledge too fast without allowing wisdom to guide them. You are not ready for that yet. Don't eat it. Watch this. There's a Greek story about a woman named Pandora. She's not supposed to open the box. The box is filled with all kinds of knowledge. Guess what she does? Don't push the red button. Of course, I'm going to push the red button. I lift the box. Out comes pestilence, pain, famine, all this stuff. And she's hopeless. She closes the box. She begins crying when the gods say, well, now that you open the box, you better open it all the way. So she opens it again, and at the bottom is something they call El Peace. El Peace, hope. And hope flies out and begins devouring all the pain and the brokenness in the world. Beautiful story? Yeah. Sometimes we eat knowledge too fast. Sometimes we're not ready for it. Sometimes we need wisdom to guide us. There's an Egyptian story about, watch this, two brothers. One of them's jealous of the other. He ends up killing him. And because of that, they lose paradise. Interesting story. They weren't quite ready for power, but they took it anyway. You guys see it? Every culture has a flood story. And here's the thing about flood stories is they are responding to floods that happened at different time eras and different places all throughout history. And so the Jewish story is that their God looks down and says, man, this is gross. It's evil. I need to clear some space. Notice, clear some space again. And so this God destroys the majority of the world except for one family. Probably Thai because they didn't eat bacon. Cleanses the world, right? Starts anew. And notice here's something really funny that people don't always pick up. If you're taking this as a literal historical telling, there were clean and unclean divisions back then. Because if you're taking this literally and you're following it through this progression, this book starts here and then this, and this. Well, it's not until Leviticus that they start saying some things are clean and unclean, right? They're inserting their culture into the story because it's what you do. The story says something much deeper. Right. Yeah, everyone's got a flood story. Our flood story is going to have elements of our culture in it. Yeah, product placement, I love it. The Greek story, of course, is this, totally different. The gods look down and say, man's evil, we got to do something, so it clears space. They cleanse the world. They start anew. And there's guess what? A boat involved. The Egyptian story, totally different. The gods look down. They say, man's evil. We need to destroy it. Let's clear some space. And guess what? There's a boat involved. Interesting, right? But they insert their own elements of Egyptian culture or Greek culture. Every culture has a flood story. But the flood story really says more about the culture and their values than it does about an incident. Because every story has a life, death, and resurrection cycle to it. And so there's the story of Tower of Babel. Genesis 11, 1 through 19. Knowledge increases, yet wisdom is not held. And so people scatter after the thing's destroyed. Interesting? Same story over and over again. The Sumerians have the same story of knowledge taken on too quickly. Abraham leaves his tribe. A promise is given. He's supposed to choose to walk in a new direction. And yet he goes back into exile into Egypt because he doesn't follow the wisdom traditions. And eventually he will find new life again. Much like Frodo. How many of you love Lord of the Rings? These stories are everywhere. I leave home. The thing doesn't work, except if I don't allow wisdom to guide me, and I just use this new power, this new knowledge without allowing wisdom to steer me, the story is going to get chaotic, right? Which is why they'll pick up a sword, but they don't know how to use it yet, right? They'll pick up certain things and they won't know how to use this to bring life, and so they'll bring more and more death until finally the aha moment happens and they allow wisdom to steer them. Abraham and Lot, interestingly enough, Abraham and Lot, when a Jewish person reads this, they do not read of Abraham and Lot. They read northern Israel and southern Israel, who got to a place where they had to separate from one another. And one actually chooses land that's more rocky, much like Abraham and Lot. The other chooses land that is more pastoral, right? One's more agrarian, the other one's more militant. Do you guys see it? When a Jewish person reads of Abraham and Lot, they see their northern and southern kingdoms. Much like any of these empires will do when they talk about their gods and their stories. Abraham is tempted. Notice when Abraham is tempted to fulfill the promise that his people would be a great nation, to be a great nation, you have to multiply. That means you do the thing. I'm looking around for children. You do the thing. He does the thing with his wife, and it doesn't take. So he chooses to sleep with a slave girl. Guess where the slave girl's from? Well, of course, it's going to be Egypt, right? Because Egypt is the picture of slavery. He chooses to do his own thing rather than hold to the wisdom tradition, and it lands him in a lot of drama, a lot of conflict. Sodom and Gomorrah, how many of you have heard this story and did a double take? Like a God that was love would burn everybody to death? Why? That seems a bit harsh. By the way, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, they're not murdered because of what people will say is homosexuality or any of that. The sin of Sodom, according to the Bible, is that they weren't loving to the stranger within their gate. That was the sin, the way they steered it. And so Sodom and Gomorrah is basically a retelling of the flood story in Genesis 3. Abraham is tested. You guys see this over and over again. We keep seeing these cycles repeat. Today, Israel has this new dilemma. What do we do with the power that we have? Do we allow it to steer us, or do we allow wisdom to steer us into the new life? What do we do? It's an old problem. It's an old question. What do we do with it? See, here's the thing. Science and history, they answer some interesting questions. They answer how. And by the way, we're not all going to agree on some of this. Cool? I don't know if you know this, the earth actually rotates around the sun. Revolves. Thank you. Rotates. Yeah, good. That's good. There's a story that the sun revolves around the earth. And that's found in the Bible. And when you take that literally, well, what do you do with it? Well, again, I would say the Bible isn't answering those scientific questions. That story was told for a reason, to bring some kind of meaning to the lives of those people. Evolutionary process shows life movements and processes, how things begin, how things move. And I'm not talking about the Big Bang. I'm not talking about those things. I'm talking about the obvious. There is some process going on. Something's happening. There's movement. There's change. We're evolving as a species. We're growing. But the Bible doesn't seek to answer that, how things moved and changed and grew. Floods happen when water overflows. They do not happen because the gods are angry with you. We know that. We know why floods happen. We know why rain falls. We know that. We know the process of air cooling. We know how it condenses. It takes dust and particles. It builds clouds. Those clouds form. They drop rain. We know that because science answers a lot of the how. But here's what story and metaphor do. Story and metaphor can answer the whys to some of our deepest questions as a culture and a society. Why does chaos continue to happen in every civilization we're in every relationship you seem to get into? Why does chaos still keep happening? Well, maybe there is some wisdom from the past we are ignoring. Why is it that we seem to keep repeating history over and over again? Could it be that there's some wisdom we're just not listening to from the past? Why do we continue to be at war, at odds with everyone? Well, maybe instead of seeking to exploit and conquer, we learn to live with and respect. At least that's what the wisdom traditions share. Why do empires keep collapsing? Why do groups fall apart? Well, when there's a tip of, when power is out of whack, things fall apart. Poverty, hunger happen when we stop seeking to make sure the widow and the orphan and the stranger within our gates are taken care of. The wisdom tradition says violence escalates more violence, and yet we continue repeating. The Bible and the stories and the metaphor and the poems, those seek to answer some of life's biggest questions, not scientifically and historically create perfectly accurate pictures. They seek to answer life's most difficult questions that we're all asking. And so I wanted to give you a bunch of different religious pieces that other groups find compelling with wisdom tradition. For the Buddhists, for the Jew, for the Hindu, for the Christian, the Muslim, the Taoist, the Sikhism, Zoroastrianism, all of these different groups, they have their wisdom traditions. And what's interesting about these is they all have interesting narratives that are actually very similar to your own. They all have interesting stories and ideas about how to bring life to the world. And if you basically condense all of those to a couple different points, here's what most of them will say. And yeah, I get it. Like, read the Bible and you'll find a lot of violence there, just like you will with the Quran and others. Dig deep enough and what you'll find, especially through the Jesus narrative, who's, again, another reflection of the deeper picture going on with Israel, is that once we learn to love one another, take care of one another, forgive one another, we bring heaven to earth. And every one of those pieces has some wisdom there that essentially will say the same thing. I like the idea of the wisdom tree. I like the idea that you and I, as seekers, we approach this tree together. But here's the thing. That tree is so big that someone on the other side of it, they may see that tree and the fruit a little differently. The way that fruit grows actually might differ. It might be the fruit might be a little bit different. It might taste a little different. It might look a little different. But we're all picking from the same wisdom tree. We're all asking some of those life's most basic questions. And a lot of the truth and the wisdom there, I think you can find in many places. How many of you have ever asked the question like, why did the Bible stop at Revelation? Because that's the main book that most of us here have read. Have you ever wondered, like, why did we stop at Revelation? How come no one's writing the next book? Is that all? Is Revelation like the stopping point? And we're like, all right, all wisdom is done. We've grown. This is it. Did you ever wonder why we're not writing more? I used to ask that question all the time, and then I realized, wait, we are. We are writing more. And that's why I love reading. I love reading because people are writing more. Anyone ever read the book To Kill a Mockingbird? Talk about social justice issues, learning to love your neighbor, learning to embrace difference. What a beautiful book. And if you look deep enough, you'll find like there's some interesting history involved in it. She also writes little elements of her own life and her own values in it. It's beautiful. Pride and Prejudice, how many of you like that book? Talk about the feminine journey. It's beautiful. Life of Pi, what a fantastic book from a different culture than your own. The Kite Runner, again, same. Origin. I had to include a Dan Brown one in there just because it's fun. War and Peace. We have all these different pieces being written because wisdom, there is no end to the wisdom that is there because we're all drawing from the same wisdom tree. And we all have new experiences to tell. What? I had to show you some cake. There's this Greek word, it means story. And how many of you like a good cake that's just super dry? Like when you think, I want my birthday cake, I want it to be a little bit of frosting on the top, but make that thing so dry that I'm just parched at the end. I need some water. I want to dip that mother in water and then eat it. Yeah, like I'll have a crouton cake, please. Yeah, no one says that. because here's the beauty of a good cake. A good cake has lots of layers to it. If you're Danielle's brother and you're making better than SEX cake, which it's not, but you have layers. He's pouring the layers, pouring, constantly building the layers. Because here's the beauty of a story. When I share a story, what it does is it invites you to add another layer from your experience. It basically adds another layer of beauty and meaning to the thing. And so the Bible, the Quran, all of the holy books, they didn't end there at the ending. What they're doing is they're inviting you to begin sharing your own, to begin building from your own experiences and adding to the wisdom tradition that's there. That's what telling a story means. And so I would invite you, when you're looking at the Bible, whatever holy book you find meaningful, here's what I would ask you to potentially do. I would ask you to look at the thing and ask the deeper question. Not, did it happen? But does it happen? Not, is this a scientific, historical, perfectly accurate piece? I would ask the bigger question. What does it mean for me? How does it help me grow? What wisdom is there that's going to bring, in the words of Jesus, heaven to earth? How will it help me become a better, fuller person and the tribe that I belong to? When you learn to do that, you no longer get in these heated debates about being right. You get into better discussions about being human. And so whenever someone tells a good story, here's what I notice. People lean in, don't they? People lean in. When a good story takes place, we lean in because we found connection there. When you lean in, you find that you and Moses have a lot in common. When you lean in, you see yourself in the person of Jesus. When you lean in, you become part of the story, and you're invited then to share your own. And so the art of deconstruction, I think, when we're speaking of faith and spirituality, I think it starts there, by learning to ask better questions of the things we read and discuss. I think it starts with asking the deeper question of, what's the point? How, why, and where do we go from here? And when you are in conversation and you're hearing the stories, watch what happens, because at some point you will find yourself asking more questions. And after you ask the questions, you'll be invited in then to share your own. Dig it? Awesome. All right. Next week, I'm going to share some thoughts on Jesus and the cross. And for many people, we grew up with a certain narrative and a certain redemption story. And so I'm going to share different ideas. This was the one topic I got the most from everyone. What does the cross really mean? Why the cross? What happens at the cross? Where did some of these ideas and interpretations come from about the cross? And so we're going to share some of those ideas next week. I hope you'll join us, because it's going to be fantastic. And truth be told, most of you asked that question the most. So anyways, very excited. Thank you for allowing safe space for us to be able to do this.